So welcome everyone to this webinar with Akemi and me. And before we start, I wanted just to explain a little bit our motivations for the art. We wrote an article that's in New Roots this month. And what motivated us to write this article and consequently prepare this webinar is that feeling that sometimes we tend to be too harsh on teenagers, or we tend to hate them too much. We look at teenagers and say, no, teenagers, no. But that sometimes we forget how it was to be a teenager back in our days, right? So that's what motivated us to go into the reasons why, understand a little, try to understand what's happening in their lives and look at them with more empathy. But that's what you're going to cover during this webinar. So let's not get carried away so far. Throughout the webinar, feel free to ask any questions you would like to, right? And then we'll do our best to try to incorporate during the webinar, or to answer them at the end of the webinar as well, right? So please do post any questions you want. We love questions, and sometimes we may ask you questions. They're genuine questions, so feel free to respond in the chat box, right? They're not only rhetorical. Akemi, do you want to say anything, complete anything?
No, yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying, Leo. We tend to think teenagers are like this nightmare. I just read that somebody mentioned here, I guess was Anna, I like working with them. We both love working with teenagers, and we think that they don't get a fair reputation. So that was our main motivation here. We are based in São Paulo, and we're checking here the chat box. There are people from Curitiba, Rio. So nice to see people from different cities. Tell us where you're listening us from. It's always nice to know. But then I guess over to you, Leah. I'll be here checking the chat box for a while.
Okay, thank you. I can see people from Bahia as well, right? Yeah, so let's get started, right? So we're talking about teenagers. So first and foremost, it's important to understand what we mean by adolescence, by these teenage years. So when it begins and when it ends, right? So if you can just type quickly in the chat box, when it begins and when it ends, it would be wonderful, right? So let's see what you've got there for us. 13, 18, okay, let's see more. 11, 19, more, 12, 17, 13, 21, nice, 14, 18, 12, 14. Do you see how variable it is? And this is something really interesting, right? So if you think about the term teenager, it would be like the teens would be like 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. But this is too linguistic and too clear-cut. And it doesn't seem to apply to real life. It's not that simple. And that's why I like this definition that I'm going to show you, that it's by Sarah Jane Blakemore, right? So Sarah Jane Blakemore is a neuroscientist, and she specializes in teenagers, and she studies the teenage brain. And she came up with this definition of what adolescence is, right? So look, that she doesn't say it starts at that age and finishes at that age. So it starts with the biological, hormonal, physical change of puberty. So it varies depending on the person, right? And ends at the age at which an individual attains a stable, independent role in society. And as she says, it can go on for a long time. And this also helps us to understand why sometimes we have young adults in this in our groups, when we're teaching in a language center, for example, sometimes we have young adults or young adults in our lives who behave as if they were teenagers. We look and say, you are behaving like a teenager, right? Because in fact, it has to do with these changes, but it's physical changes, but it also has to do with their role in society. So, and until they are able to say, I am an individual, I'm not the son or the daughter of, in my case, Ophelia and Flavia and Flavio, you are not an adult, you are still a teenager. So this is a very interesting definition to help us see that it is variable and it has to do with physical and social conditions, right? Yes, some people who are late 30s and still teenagers, right? And another part from this quote that I like to call your attention to is the part of biological, hormonal, and physical changes. So teenage years is a moment of change. And I want to explore some of these changes with you, right? So first of all, we have biological changes, right? So in terms of the brain development, we have the prefrontal cortex is still under development. So the prefrontal cortex is more or less this part of the brain. And it is a very important structure in our brain, and it is responsible for lots of different functions. For example, it is responsible for helping us to focus our attention, to predict consequences of our actions, to anticipate things that may happen in the environment surrounding us. So we look at something and we say, that's going to happen, right? Control our impulses, manage emotional reactions, planning future actions and future attitudes, for example, and future consequences as well. And adjust this complex behavior, right? So like cause and consequence. So, or I cannot do this until that happens. So all of this is controlled by the prefrontal cortex. But the prefrontal cortex is under development. So you can see that all these functions that I've mentioned, they are not fully controlled by teenagers. Biologically, the prefrontal cortex will only be fully developed by mid-20s. So it depends a little bit on the person, right? But it's like mid-20s, then they will be fully developed. So we can see that we can start to understand, when we think about these functions that I've mentioned, we can start to understand a little bit their behaviors. But I'm going to get there in a second. I just want to mention, to explain to you a little bit the amygdala functions, right? So the amygdala is a structure that's more or less in the middle of the brain, it's a tiny structure. But it's very important to control emotions, survival instinct, memory, the perception of emotions, so anger, fear, sadness, and then remember Inside Out, the film. It depicts very well these emotions, right? And it has to do with this overactive amygdala, right? And it's also related to controlling aggression, right? So now think about all of this. Think about behavioral consequences, right? So we have all of these characteristics. Emotions are everywhere, right? So and the prefrontal cortex cannot control everything very well. And on top of that, there are the hormones from the puberty, which marks the beginning of adolescence, right? So the hormones are there, and those who have been through PMS or those who have been pregnant know the power hormones have on our emotions as well, right? I always remember a friend of mine when she's a doctor, and when she was pregnant, she would have some extreme reactions, and she would tell me, I know that I'm being silly. I know that this shouldn't be the reaction I'm having to that situation, but I can't control. So think about the teenagers with all these hormones all over their bodies and with difficulties controlling attention, predicting consequences, controlling their impulses, managing their reaction, planning for the future, and everything. All of these will culminate in behavior, in behaviors, right? So how they behave, especially for us teachers, right, in the classroom. That's when we usually have more contact with them. Most typical behaviors that are a consequence of these physical changes, right? So for them, it's difficult to see things from another person's perspective. So sometimes they still cannot see the consequence of their actions. So sometimes and it sometimes can be even related to bullying. So sometimes they cannot understand how some kind of attitude is going to impact the other. So I called him that name, but it's just a joke. He can't understand that this can really offend their sometimes even their friends, right? So it's difficult for them to see this relation. With time, they start being better able to do that, right? But it's still something to be developed. Decision making is hard for them. So sometimes if they have too many options, it's difficult to decide. So this doesn't mean that you're not going to let them decide anything and give them everything ready for them, because then they will feel that you're imposing and that they have no voice whatsoever. But it's important to help them with the decision, help them see the consequences of their own decisions, because this is something that's being developed. They have difficulties in controlling their impulses, right? Their emotions are all over the place, and they have difficulties planning. So if you tell them, I need this project, those who know me a little better know that I love project work. Projects involve lots of steps. If we don't help them plan for these steps, it's prone to failure because they have difficulties planning. So we can help them. They need our support there, right? So we can see that lots of their behaviors are not because they are evil people. It's not because they hate you. It's not because of anything like that. It's just because their bodies are changing, right? And it has consequences. They are still learning how to deal with all of that, right? So far, any questions? No? Okay. So I brought here for you 4 profiles. And then you can see that we have the characteristic for the teens, right? So they have lots of peer pressure. They're growing in sexual maturity. They are more rebellious. They are more emotional. They are more inclined to take risks. Remember, all of these, to a certain extent, related to the development of their brains, right? They're also concerned about being treated as adults, so they don't want to be seen as children anymore, because then we start to see their role, the social role of things in their lives, right? So they need to see how that they will start to have this. Remember, the stable independent role in society, they have to stop being a child and have this stable role. And you have all the way towards that. If they are treated as children, they will never get this stable independent role. They will never be independent individuals. They will always be the child. They will always be linked to someone else. They will never be truly independent, right? They are still learning how to be more analytical, more systematic, how to deal with abstraction. And they are extremely body conscious because they start to grow fairly quickly. They need sometimes, especially younger teens, they need some time to adjust to their bodies to this new configuration. Like they have their for the girls, their bodies change a lot in terms of shape and everything. For the boys, there's the issue of the voice. The voice changes, and until it is fully established, they will have lots of in the middle of their talk. So they are really self-conscious about that. So that's why sometimes boys tend to be quiet in the classroom, because they don't want to to be surprised by their own voices in the middle of a sentence, for example, right? That's why sometimes girls don't want to stand up in the front of the classroom to write something on the board. And sometimes they are also living, we have this feeling that they live in a world of their own. In what sense they live in a world of their own? They are processing all this information and sometimes all these emotions. So it is this moment of understanding who they are in society. So we do have this impression. And we can never forget where they come from, so, and where they're going to. So children and adults, because teenagers are between these two moments, and the change is not overnight. The changes are gradual. So they're not going to have all these features of teenagers suddenly. They will, their attention span, for example, that's shorter when they're children. It will start to get longer as they become teens. Nowadays, it's not going to be that long anymore, because even adults don't have that long attention span anymore for lots of different reasons. But we cannot forget this relation. It is a process, right? So when they are 13, they have more features of children. When they are 19, they have more features of adults. However, they are teenagers, and we cannot ignore that, right? And here comes the importance of talking about empathy. And Akemi is going to develop that a little bit more while I take care of the chat then, right?
Right. So I guess when it comes to teenagers, we really need to understand, and we can't stress enough all kinds of developments that they're going through, right? As Leo was talking about, there are a lot of biological changes, physical changes going on, and all this new connections, all these new neural pathways are being created all the time, right? And I guess before we're talking about how we can have a more empathetic look towards teenagers, we need to understand a little bit how we actually can develop empathy, not only about ourselves, but also with teenagers, right? How do we develop empathy? How do we foster empathy, right? So we're trying to answer this question now. The first thing is that we need to look a little bit at a concept called neuroplasticity. Is this a concept that you're familiar with? Maybe you just could tell me a yes, no, YN on the chat. Have you heard of neuroplasticity before? We got a yes. Okay, we gotta know. Right, so just to understand, whenever we're talking about development and learning, neuroplasticity is our keyword when we talk about how our brain works, right? Um, in a simple way to explain this complex this complex system is to understand that neuroplasticity is the capacity that our brains have to rewire, to change their connections, to change their pathways. It's strengthening pathways between neurons that are exercised and used. So what's the idea here? For example, when I was a teenager, I studied Japanese. And until today, Japanese is a very relevant language for me. So, this is part of my culture, this is part of my context. So, I still speak fairly good Japanese. My brain keeps these connections connected to Japanese strong because, I constantly see them. I'm constantly talking to people that speak Japanese. This is part of my life. So, all these pathways are like strengthening all the time. But at the same time that our brain does that, it also weakens the connections between cells that are not used. So I was talking Japanese. I also studied French as a teenager. And French is not part of my life at all. I can't speak any French. Actually, I just maybe know one or two phrases. So this is not part of my life anymore. And what my brain does, what my brain did is that they get these connections that were related to French, and they're now weak because my brain understands that this is not relevant to me anymore. So neuroplasticity is this capacity that the brain understands what is relevant to me and make these connections stronger, right? And what is not relevant, they make these connections weaker, right? So this leads us to this conclusion that rewiring our brain circuits is experience dependent. So we need to keep in constant touch and constant practicing skills and abilities to make them stronger. This is nothing new for us teachers, right? We teachers keep on telling students all the time that you need to practice to learn, to keep on learning, and that's it. So that's how our brain works, right? But what does it has to do with empathy then? First of all, just to make sure, I guess we all understand empathy the same way. I got to this definition. That's the way, Leticia and I understand empathy, is that this is the ability to observe experiences and feelings of someone else and to be able to find and connect with that feeling within ourselves, right? So I guess empathy is this idea, right? As somebody said here, be in their shoes, right? So it's this idea of being able to step into somebody else's shoes, to understand what they're feeling, to feel what they're feeling. Maybe we never had these experiences before. But we just saw, when we're talking about neuroplasticity, that learning and development is experience dependent. So the point is, how can we develop empathy? How can we develop this empathetic look towards experiences that we might never leave, right? And this is something beautiful about our brain that brings us to this specific group of cells, this specific group of amazing cells called the mirror neurons. We all have these cells that at some point people were still doing some research to see if this is actually what happened in our brain. This is something new. I guess in the past 2-3 decades people have been talking about mirror neurons, and they associate this group of cells with the development of empathy. So what are they then? So these are cells that we have that allow us to learn by imitation. So, for example, we all have been through this situation before. You are like talking to another person. For example, I love to talk like putting my hand on my hair. I do that all the time. So sometimes I'm talking to a person, and in like 5 or 10 minutes, the person's doing the same. The person's like putting their hands just like Elai's doing in their hair. So it's this idea that you're seeing somebody doing something and you instantly copy this movement without even thinking so much about it. This is also common, for example, when somebody in the room just yawns, and maybe you're like super excited, but then you start yawning as well, and then everybody does the same. You just see somebody doing something and you copy it without thinking too much, right? So this group of cells are responsible for that, just copying movements. Okay. Sometimes we're talking here about something just physical. So you saw somebody do that and you did the same. But in other situations, we might actually feel what the other person is feeling. For example, you probably you probably have been in this situation before. You are walking on the street and you see somebody tripping, or maybe somebody just fell. First, you might start to laugh if you're a horrible person because we do that. But also, it's common that we kind of feel what this person is feeling. So, for example, if the person fell and hurt their arm, maybe instantly we just touch our arm to make sure our arm is okay, because we flinch, we feel this pain at the same time, right? So, in a way, we are copying this movement, but in this way, we're coping with feelings. So we're trying to feel the same thing, right? Is that okay? Is this concept of imitation okay? Right. So the interesting thing about the mirror neurons, then I like this comment here, is that they allow us to understand other people's mind, not only through conceptual reasoning, but through imitation. So it's about feeling, not thinking. It's not that I start to make, a logical conclusion about the things. Oh, this person fell on the street. This person might be hurt. So this person might be feeling this. I understand the pain. It's not like this connection of something is structured and logical. You just feel the same. You just feel the same thing at the same time. So it's an immediate reaction. That's why we sometimes say that mirror neurons are the ones responsible for empathy, because they are the ones that allow us to actually put ourselves into somebody else's shoes. And then we feel the same thing, right? So they are very important whenever we talk about this idea of developing empathy, because we want our students, and I guess we want ourselves, to be able to look at somebody else's experience and somehow understand this as a kind of mirror and copy the reaction and understand this reaction, feeling the same way, right? And this has all to do with the kind of things we do in our classes, with the kinds of stories we bring into our classes and how we deal with them in our classes. A nice metaphor that I always like to talk about when we talk about designing curriculum and designing the things we bring to our class is this concept that Emily Style developed of looking at our curriculum, understanding that they are mirrors and they are windows. And I'm going to make a connection here with the idea of empathy. For Emily, the idea of mirrors is to have in our curriculums, to have in our classes, possibilities that our students, in our focus here, our teenagers, can see their experiences happening there in the class, so they can relate to what we're bringing to class. So they deserve a curriculum which mirrors their own experience back to them. Validating the public world of the school, validating their experiences in the world of school, but also in our curriculum, in our lessons, we have to have room for windows. So this is the opportunity that students have to take a look into the experience of others, right, who also need and deserve the public validation of the school curriculum. When we look at windows, we're talking directly here about empathy. So you're being able to, open this window and look at this fresh air of an experience that you've never experienced before, and maybe you might never experience that in your whole life. And this window somehow turns into a mirror for you. You're able to see yourself in that experience and connect to that, to find points of connections, right? Windows can turn into mirrors all the time. And then we can kind of copy that situation, copy that feeling, and be able to understand what people are feeling in this specific situations. And for teenagers, I guess this is more than, it's more essential to teenagers because they really need good models of everything. So if we're talking about the development of empathy, they need to have models to put their empathy skills into test, to develop them. So we just listed a couple of questions here. Maybe we're not going to go over all the questions, but whenever you're thinking about the classes you're designing and what kind of stories you're bringing into your classroom. And by stories here, we think about, all kind of input you bring, all kind of, it could be like books, movies, shows, images, that all kind of texts. What kind of stories are you bringing into your classroom to make your teenagers actually use them as good mirrors and good windows, right? So Maria Inês was talking about building rapport. So building rapport is really important, right, between you and your group, but also encourage them to build rapport inside the group, not only with the people that are there and the experiences that they have, but also, this vast majority of stories that they have in the world, right? So sometimes we, as Liz said, we act and we think like, okay, why they can't understand that this is the way that they should do things? Why they can't understand that this is right, this is wrong? Well, because they can't. They're not ready yet to do that. But if they're not exposed to different stories and different experiences, maybe they'll never know, right? So they'll never be empathetic towards us. I've heard a lot that from teachers, okay, we want to understand the teenagers, but they can't understand where I'm coming from. Right, they can't yet, but that's why we're building that. So the whole idea of fostering empathy is based on that, the kind of models that we offer all the time. And of course, we as teachers can be models as well, right? So far, so good. Have any questions about that? I guess we're okay.
We had a question about neuroplasticity, if it's a constant competence or if it changes as the person ages.
It changes, it does change, but I guess we'll have neuroplasticity throughout our whole lives, right? But kids and teenagers, they have like stronger pathways all the time and a bigger number of connections being developed at the same time. And as we grow older, we still have these connections. We have like new neurons for our whole lives, but, the number is more limited. And this is interesting because I guess when I was a kid, I think people didn't know that. We thought that at some point in life, we didn't have like new neurons anymore. But that's not true. We'll have that for our whole lives. But of course, in a smaller amount, right? That's why the word of teenagers is that intense, because a lot of development is going on inside their brain that in my age, for example, is not anymore. So it's a bit calmer, right? Okay. So we talked here, Leigh and I talked here all about biological development, all these changes that are going on inside their brains. But something that we can't forget, that all these developments, they do not happen like into the void, right? We have to take into consideration the social context. Being a teenager today is not the same that being a teenager when I was a teenager and when Leo were teenagers, right? So things change because the whole context that we live in change. And this has an impact in our development as well. So social and biological, physical, they're all walking together. And we wanted to take a bit of look at the social context that we are now. What kind of world our teenagers are living now, right? So I guess we all having this moment that is, it seems a little bit after the pandemic, but it's still the pandemic, right? Lots of schools are going back to face, and then they go back to remote, and then they go back to face. We've heard, lots of stories like that, but there are still schools that are still remote. So this kind of mess is the social context that we are in, right? And we wanted to share with you some results of this survey that was conducted. The first edition of this survey was conducted last year. That is about youth and the pandemic. It was conducted last year, I guess June. And this year, they conducted a new edition of the same survey. So this survey this year was conducted last May with almost 70,000 Brazilian teenagers. Last year was a smaller number, like about 30,000 Brazilian teenagers. So this year we have like a bigger number, and that's great because then we can have even more reliable results. If you are interested, I guess you can scan the code here or print that, screenshot this, and then you can look at the whole data. We just highlighted 3 points that we wanted to share with you. They're more connected to the social context, right? But we do recommend you that you take a look at the whole survey, right? Le and I will spend a lot of time analyzing the data. It's really interesting. So the things that we chose to highlight here to discuss with you, these 60,000, almost 70,000 teenagers answered lots of questions about different topics. One of them is they were asked to evaluate, to assess how their physical and mental health is. So how much awareness they had about their physical and mental health. So these were some of the topics, and they had to check if they, in this past year, they feel that this is part of their lives. So we have here 61% of these teenagers said anxiety is part of their lives. It's a huge number. So that's why we said the social context is important here. So 60% of these teenagers feel they're anxious all the time. And there are also other high numbers like excessive use of social media. These numbers really interesting here. 40% of the teenagers mentioned they have insomnia. And we know that this is really super important for the teenagers to develop, to mature lots of things. They need to sleep. They need to have to get proper hours of sleep, and they're not getting it. So this, of course, is going to impact the results, like in school and all kinds of results. There are also here smaller numbers, but they're very serious things still. So it's 10% mentioned an increased consumption of drugs, 9% self-mutilation or suicidal ideas. So they're really serious results here for us to understand these teenagers, what kind of teenagers we're having in our classrooms. This is the reality. Another result that we wanted to highlight here with you is that they were asked what kind of content they find relevant at school, right? I believe here most of us, or maybe all of us, we are teachers, we are connected to class. So it's interesting to know what they expect from our classes, right? What they expect from us. And here there is a comparison between the survey that was conducted last year and this year, right? So there's 2020 and 2021. So the highest number here, the content they really expect to see in lessons is dealing with emotions. So they feel that this content should be in classes, in our lessons, in school in general. So it's something for us to consider, right? How much of our planning, how much of our classes, how much of the activities that we have address this need. And this is a serious need, 61% of them says they need that. And if we compare that to the number of last year, it increased a little bit. So they still feel, or even more, the need to know how to deal with their emotions. Remember, 60% said they're feeling anxious more than they should. So something interesting that calls our attention is this their need in terms of school subjects. And here we're talking about content in a more regular kind of way, right? Like last year, the 35% of the teenagers only mentioned that they wanted school subjects. They wanted content related to the topics of school. But this number has increased. So we feel that while teenagers are still managing to deal with their emotions in these times, they feel that, okay, there's some content that I missed last year. I need that content as well. So interesting for us to consider. And there are other topics here like time management, culture, and having challenge games, quizzes. Interesting that they feel they want only 80% want games and challenges in class. So maybe we overused this last year. I don't know. Okay. And one more thing, and that's the last piece of data that we wanted to share with you, is that they were asked which format of instruction they want after the pandemic. So understanding that pandemic is over finally, so everybody's like fully vaccinated, we can go back to our normal lives or whatever our normal lives are going to be, right? Which format they want. So we highlighted here, there are two numbers because we highlighted this specific segment from 15 to 17 because other age groups were also interviewed. And so in the first on the left side you have like the general result of the survey, and then on the right side specifically this group 15 to 17. And if we see here, like 54%, more than half, and 59% in the 15-17 segment want 100% face-to-face classes. So they miss the face-to-face connection, right? So some of us, I guess we miss the face-to-face connection. I know I do, Lê does as well. We talk about that all the time. And then this huge number of teenagers, more than half, they also miss the contact with people. So we have this kind of myth that teenagers don't talk to anybody. They don't like to talk to anybody. They want to live in their own world. Yes, but also they miss these connections. Somebody said they're screaming for face-to-face. I guess we all are. And that's an interesting result. Like that's a huge number prefers 100% face-to-face. So we just highlighted the answer to these three questions because, I mean, we have like limited time here. But we advise you, we can put the link again for you to take a look at the whole survey. So keeping this in mind, right, keeping the idea how empathy develops, or what we have to bring to class to allow teenagers to develop their empathy skills, and understanding this social context, this is what they're dealing with. And remember, we are having a hard time to deal with all that, and we are a bit more developed in terms of our pathways than they are. So considering all that, what are the classroom implications that we have about that? And then over to you, Lê, to go on here.
Yeah, so probably at this point you've noticed that in terms of development, inside their bodies, it is everything a mess. Hormonal mess and everything, but the world outside is also really messy. So imagine how this pandemic affected teenagers, right? So they want to find their place in the world, but the world is it's the way we've been facing, right? And all of this mess in teenagers' lives and now in their social context has consequences, right? And implications for the classroom. We selected some of these consequences, right? So one of them is this feeling that they are frequently off task. Remember that I've mentioned that sometimes they give the impression that they are living in their own world. Sometimes this being off task means that they are trying to deal with their emotions. They are trying to deal with what's going on in their lives at that point, right? They are also prone to emotional outbursts. And that's a very beautiful way to say that sometimes they can burst into tears in the middle of the classroom, for example, or they can get really angry really quickly and unexpectedly. So remember, they cannot control their emotions very well. They're still developing that. Physically, they cannot do that, and they have the hormones going on. So emotions are everywhere. And they also have this inability to see how the others, how their own behavior affect others, and this can make them have attitudes that are not so welcome in the classroom, right? And they seem to have an excuse for everything, like, I didn't do this because of this, and that, but I had to, but my dog ate my homework, I don't know. But this is them processing the world around them. And remember, they have difficulties getting organized and planning. So these excuses are many times a consequence of this lack of planning skills. And then what happens is that they truly believe that that's the cause of of them not being able to deliver something or to do something. As adults, we look and say, come on, this is not an excuse because this isn't that. But at that point, they do have difficulties planning. So for them, they think, and that's the reason why. And they have difficulty seeing cause and consequence. They're developing that. So this also contributes to these excuses being given, right? They also do very little homework. Part of that is because they have problems organizing themselves, organizing their time, and there's so much going on in their lives that if homework is not interesting enough, or if it's just too routine, they end up forgetting or not giving the due importance to that. Right? When you're talking about online classes, they also tend to keep their cameras off, and this can come from lots of different places. One is that they don't see the impact that it causes on the teacher. As teachers, we know that we miss having this instant feedback that comes from their expressions in the camera, but they cannot perceive this consequence. Another point for that may be because of their self-consciousness. They may be ashamed of showing their own homes. Think that online classes were a bit chaotic, at least in the beginning, but it's still right. So when they open their cameras, they are opening their homes. And this is not their independent selves, because it's their parents' homes. It's not themselves. Sometimes they have they are trying to form a totally different identity. Or sometimes they are here and their parents go by and they don't want their peers to see their parents. And they, when you have the cameras on, you are observed all the time. It's different from the classroom. When you are in the classroom, you can see who is looking at you. When you are in an online classroom, you don't know who is looking at what you are doing. And you can freeze in an awkward position, and you can become a stick, and they can make a meme out of you, their friends, because they don't see how this can be offensive and so on. So this is what usually happens for on how it's going on, right? About keeping the cameras off, there are some studies, some researchers with interviews, qualitative data carried out with teenagers, in which they report that is why they sometimes don't do that. And then when we see these testimonials and this survey, we can understand why, based on their characteristics, right? Developmental characteristics. And they also sometimes don't see the purpose of lessons. And then when they don't see the purpose of lessons, they switch off very easily. And sometimes they also don't connect with the lesson. And this has to do with their social context as well. All what students need and want at this point is to make connections, and new connections, right? And this is interesting to see and to connect with the idea of them wanting to go back to face, right? So this lack of connection, if they don't feel can make this connection with the lessons, they will also lose interest if the lesson doesn't relate to their lives and this kind of things, right? So Mauro is asking about bullying. Yeah, so bullying has to do with their stage of cognitive development as well. And it is even more serious when you talk about the online environment. One, because you have this, you don't know who, you are like more fragile online, and things, when they go online, they don't disappear as easily as when they happen in a face-to-face environment, right? So many times bullying is this need for them to get this connection with, to impress their peers, saying, look how cool I am, because they want to impress their peers. The opinion of their peers is very important for them. But at the same time, is their failure into perceiving how serious and how this can impact their peers, right? So this also contributes to bullying, right? So yeah, so Mauro is asking about how we feel, right? Giving the talk without seeing the audience. I would prefer to see you. It would be better. It's always best when we can see our audience, especially because we can see your reactions and we can gauge. We can see if someone's not following, if someone doesn't, is totally has already understood, so we don't have to explain that again. So it would be better. But when we have an audience like with 70 people, we wouldn't be able to see all the 70 in front of us. It wouldn't make a difference because you would be too small, right? So it's a matter of adjusting to the environment. If we were 70 people face to face, I would prefer. I am with that 59% who wants to go face to face again, right? And but something important about that is that we're talking a lot about empathy, about a lot about what's going on in teenagers' lives, but we cannot see that as an excuse for their behavior. They behave like that because they're teenagers, and that's it. No, it's not. We have to use this information and this knowledge to know how to choose the best course of action to deal with these teenagers. So, okay, so they are these have this inability to see how their behaviors affect others. Okay, what can I do to help them see their the others? So how can I help them with this awareness of the impact of what they're doing? How can I remember the what Akemi mentioned about the stories? So which stories am I telling them? Which stories am I exposing them to? Am I showing them just one view or one point of view? Why not showing different points of view or different possibilities? And also explaining why, for you, it makes a difference if your cameras are on or off. Because sometimes they simply can't imagine that for the teacher or the presenters, seeing their faces would be better, right? And then also understand, okay, why don't you turn your camera on and so on? So it's understanding these is a starting point to try to turn the situation around. So we collected some practical ideas, I'd say, to try to turn the situation around, right? So based on the features of teenagers. So I'd say that first and foremost, don't take things personally. Sometimes we have the feeling that teenagers are already antagonizing us. It's not personal. It's not you. It's not anything like that. It's just that they are finding their way, their place in the world. So they want to see how far they can go. So it's not with you, but it's important to be consistent in that sense. So if you tell them, this is the limit all the time and for everybody. We cannot have the limit for the trouble learner, and this limit would go a little further if you're talking about a learner that it has never caused trouble before. So we cannot do that. we have to be consistent, because then it will help them understand also the consequences of their action. So I cannot do this. If I do this, that will happen. If you change this, what will happen, depending on the person or the situation, it's harder for them to understand this relation, and it's harder for them to follow. I have very vivid memories of some teachers from my teenage years who were extremely strict about some things. So this is the rule, and that's it. They were really consistent. And although they were strict, but within a reasonable, with good reasons, let's say, they were the most beloved teachers at school. So it wasn't a matter of allowing us teenagers to do whatever we wanted, but more a matter of being consistent. And if they understand why you're doing something, it also helps to get them on your side. So this is the limit because of this. And that's it. Do you want to negotiate? Understand why, right? And this is important, talking about negotiation, right? Listen and respond to them genuinely. And listen to their emotions as well. Sometimes they may be talking about, they may be totally desperate because their crush hasn't replied the message they sent 5 minutes ago. As an adult, we look and we say, come on, that's not a reason for that desperation. But they don't have repertoire of life, so that they don't know. We as adults, we have been through much more serious situations, but they haven't. So for them, at that point, this is the most important thing that's going on. If you simply ignore this emotion, they will totally switch off your lesson. They won't be able to connect because this trouble will always be in their minds. If you listen to this trouble and respond to that, oh, that's a bummer. That's so sad. Maybe he's in a class and cannot answer now. Maybe the battery died or something like that. You listened, you addressed, it's like 1 minute, and you move on. And then chances are that this teenager is going to be there with you a little bit more, right? So listen and respond to them. Really listen to them. They need to be heard. Also, they need to see themselves in the classroom. They want to see themselves. And this see themselves can be something really simple. It can be, for example, putting as a background music for the lesson a song that they chose. You don't need to work with the lyrics of the song, for example. But you can use that as a background for them. But it is the song that they chose. Or allowing them to have some decisions. But remember, it's hard for them to make decisions at this point. So guide them in this decision. Give them options, A or B. What do you prefer? And how can you bring you to the classroom? Do you want to, online classes, personalize the backdrop, the background for your camera? Do that so nobody will see your home. And then you can personalize and you can see yourself there. Choosing topics that is of interest for them as well. Knowing your learners, right? It doesn't have to be every single lesson, because what's interesting for one learner is not for the other. But throughout the term, bring in some things that will help them see them there, right? When you're dealing with misbehavior, focus on the action, not on themselves. Because it's not them, it's the action that was a problem. Involving learners in the class decisions, I've already mentioned. Involve them in their learning process. Help them understand why it's important to, why they need to do homework, for example. Involve them in this learning process. Have them take responsibility for their actions. Help them see the consequences of not doing things, right? Help them with time management and planning. Have short-term term ends. Don't say by the end of the semester, by the end of the term. No, but for next class, in 2 lessons, for the next 10 minutes. Shorter things are easier for them to cope with. Be clear of what you expect from them as well. This is important because it's easier for them to do that. They genuinely many times don't know, right? Try to make homework more motivating, more engaging, giving them a reason to do that, something that they can bring to class later on that they may use, or something that can help them see themselves in the lesson. So they will bring that to class. And also take into consideration, I guess, from all of this, take into consideration their emotional needs, because their emotions are all over the place. And as we saw in the survey, they do have this, they want to have their emotions addressed. So take into consideration their emotional needs, right? And we don't have any more time, but we have our references that we would like to share with you. If you want to take a screenshot, I know that it's going to, the webinar is also going to Disal's YouTube channel, so you can also see there, right? And I wanted to thank you very much for joining us. I saw that Akemi also put our emails in the chat box, but our email is also there on screen. Akemi, do you want to say any final words?
No, we just like to thank everybody for this incredible participation. We couldn't see each other's faces as we're saying, but we could read your comments here in the chat, so it makes us feel less lonely, right? Reading your comments here, so thank you. But also like to thank Disal for having us once again. And don't forget to scan the QR code here. We'd love to see you at Troika. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. See you. Maybe see you. Really see you in another opportunity. Right?
That's true.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.